Rafael López was a man forged in dust and faith. At 45, his face bore the marks of a life dedicated to the forgotten, to those whom the Mexican society of the 90s preferred to ignore. Born and raised in the violent alleys of Tijuana, he knew the language of the street, but chose that of the pulpit. His parish, the Church of Our Lady of Guadalupe, was more than a stone refuge. It was the beating heart of a community that bled daily from cartel violence. Rafael was not just a priest, he was a father, a brother, a protector. His cassock, often stained with grease or dust, was the symbol of a clergyman who was not afraid to get his hands dirty to build a better future for his people. I ask that if this story touches your heart, you subscribe to the channel. We are trying to reach 1,000 subscribers, and with your help, we can continue to bring stories like this. Also, comment on where you are watching from. It's amazing to see how far these narratives reach and the power these stories have to connect us. His church did not possess magnificent stained glass windows or noble wooden pews. It was a simple construction, erected with the sweat and hope of the faithful. The walls, painted a white that struggled to remain pure amidst the pollution, sheltered tired souls in search of solace. Father Rafael led community efforts to fix roofs, organize soup kitchens that fed hundreds of families, and spent hours hearing confessions that went far beyond sins, delving into the pains of misery and fear. He believed that faith needed to be practical, a tool to alleviate earthly suffering, not just a promise of paradise. The atmosphere he cultivated inside was an oasis of peace, a stark contrast to the chaos that reigned outside, where the laws were dictated by the power of guns and the dirty money of drug trafficking that corrupted everything and everyone. At the center of Rafael's world were Miguel and Javier, two altar boys, 12 and 13 years old, whose smiles were the personification of the innocence he fought so desperately to preserve. He saw them not just as helpers at Mass, but as sons entrusted to him by life. He taught them to read the scriptures with the same patience he showed them how to fix a bicycle or kick a ball in the churchyard. Miguel, the older one, dreamed of being a doctor, while Javier, with his timid voice, wanted to be a teacher. They represented the promise of a different future, living proof that it was possible to bloom amidst the refuse. For Rafael, protecting those boys was protecting the very soul of the community, the seed of a tomorrow he refused to surrender to the darkness. However, the darkness was always lurking, a hungry shadow that stretched through the neighborhood streets. The local cartel, a violent and unscrupulous faction, saw the youth as an army to be recruited or an obstacle to be eliminated. The walls graffitied with the cartel's acronyms served as a constant reminder of who truly held the power. Rafael waged a silent war against this influence. His sermons spoke not only of God, but of dignity, honor, and the courage to say no to the easy path of crime. This stance put him on a direct collision course with the trafficking bosses, who saw the priest as an impediment to their business, a shepherd who stubbornly refused to hand his sheep over to the wolves surrounding the fold. One afternoon, the latent tension materialized. One of the cartel's recruiters, a young man with the empty gaze of someone who had seen and done too much, tried to entice a group of boys in the plaza in front of the church. Rafael intervened, his imposing presence and his usually calm voice thundering with strength. He used not words of condemnation, but of disappointment, reminding the young man that he too had once been a boy from that community before he got lost. The recruiter, taken by surprise, backed down, but not before casting a look filled with hatred and a veiled promise that the priest would regret his interference. That seemingly small confrontation was the trigger that would seal the fate of innocence and awaken a sleeping demon. In the solitude of his modest room, late at night, Rafael felt the weight of his mission. Kneeling before a small wooden crucifix, his faith was tested with every siren that cut through the night, with every story of violence that reached his ears. His prayers were an honest and, at times, desperate dialogue with a God who seemed too distant from the brutality of his world. He asked for strength, not for himself, but to continue being the beacon his community needed. He knew that hope was a fragile commodity, and fear a contagious plague. That man, who offered comfort to so many, rarely found peace for himself, for he carried on his shoulders the responsibility for lives he deeply loved. The last day of peace was bathed in a golden late-afternoon light that made the dust of the streets almost poetic. During Mass, the voices of Miguel and Javier echoed through the church nave, pure and full of life, as they assisted Rafael at the altar. The priest watched them with a pride that barely fit in his chest. In that moment, surrounded by his congregation, with the boys by his side, he felt a spark of genuine hope. Maybe, just maybe, love and faith could truly win. It was a perfect photograph of a world that, in a few hours, would be shattered forever, a sacred memory that would become the fuel for a profane and devastating fire. At the end of the day, after helping to clean the sacristy, Miguel and Javier said goodbye to the priest, promising to return the next morning for catechism. "See you tomorrow, Father," they said in unison, their voices echoing in the growing silence of the church. Rafael blessed them and watched them run out the door, their laughter mingling with the sounds of the neighborhood at dusk. For a moment, his gaze was drawn to a dark car with tinted windows, parked across the street. A cold sensation ran down his spine, a dark premonition that he quickly dismissed as fatigue. He turned, closed the heavy wooden door, and did not see the boys turn the corner, walking straight into the ambush that would swallow them and transform a man of God into the most feared angel of vengeance. The next morning was born cold and grey, a reflection of the dread settling in the community's heart. The hours passed with no sign of Miguel and Javier. Despair took shape in the figure of Maria, Miguel's mother, who burst into the church with eyes swollen from crying and a voice torn by anguish. It was an anonymous phone call that led them to a vacant lot on the edge of the neighborhood, a place used as a clandestine cemetery by the cartel. There, amidst the trash and tall grass, lay the bodies of the boys. Rafael felt the air leave his lungs. The sight of his protégé, whose faces he had blessed the night before, now marked by the most abject brutality, was the blow that shattered his world. That piece of land, forgotten by God, became for the priest the altar of a profane sacrifice he could never forgive or forget. The arrival of the police was a spectacle of indifference and cynicism. The squad cars stopped, and the officers got out with a bureaucratic slowness, treating the crime scene as a mere inconvenience in their day. To them, these were just two more bodies, anonymous statistics in the endless drug war. Rafael, his soul on fire, tried to speak, to explain who the boys were, about the threat he had made to the cartel recruiter. His words, however, hit a wall of apathy. One of the detectives, with a look of contempt, suggested that the boys were probably involved in something. It was in that moment that Rafael understood the depth of the rot. The law was not there to protect the innocent, but to manage appearances, ensuring the corrupt system continued to function without major disruption. Back in his church, the silence was torture. The place that had once been a sanctuary of peace now seemed like a cold, empty mausoleum. Rafael walked slowly to the altar, his steps echoing like hammer blows on his conscience. He raised his eyes to the large wooden crucifix, to the image of a suffering Christ, and the faith that had sustained him his entire life disintegrated. The pain gave way to a blasphemous fury. He screamed, a guttural, primal sound that tore through the sacred silence, unleashing his anger and disappointment on a God who had remained silent, while his children were massacred. "Where were you?" he bellowed at the inert image. "Why? What kind of father abandons his children to the wolves?" The lack of an answer was the only truth he found. That night, locked in his room, Rafael fought the final battle for his soul. Prayers turned into accusations, pleas for forgiveness into promises of vengeance. He understood that the faith he preached, patience and resignation, were useless virtues in a world governed by brutality. The evil that took Miguel and Javier was not a theological abstraction, but a concrete force with names and addresses. If heaven offered no justice and the law on earth was a sham, then justice would have to come from somewhere else. It would have to come from his own hands. In that moment of overwhelming pain, he understood that passivity would not bring his children back. Justice needed an arm to act, and he would be that arm. If you have ever felt powerless in the face of injustice and wished you could do something, you understand the spark that ignited in his soul. Subscribing to this channel helps us tell more stories about people who, at their limit, decided to act. Moved by this new and terrible resolution, he went down to the church basement, a damp and forgotten place smelling of earth and time. He pried loose some floorboards, revealing a secret compartment. Inside, wrapped in an old cloth, was a wooden box. Rafael opened it, and his fingers touched the cold steel of a pistol, a ghost from a life he had abandoned long before finding God. The gun, heavy and well-oiled, felt like an extension of his own fury. As he held it, the weight of the metal in his hand sealed his decision. There was no more conflict. Father Rafael López was dead, buried with the boys in the vacant lot. In his place, a spectre rose, an avenging angel whose only liturgy would be celebrated with fire and blood. Rafael's revenge began on a starless night. His first target was a man named Hector, one of the cartel's lookouts, known for his big mouth and petty cruelty. Rafael watched him for days, learning his routine, the path he took through the dark alley to get home. Armed with an intimate knowledge of the streets that the priesthood had never erased, he prepared his ambush. Before leaving, he looked at himself in the mirror, the pistol hidden under his worn cassock, and felt a chill. The man staring back at him was not a shepherd, but a wolf in sheep's clothing. The internal conflict was a storm, but the image of Miguel and Javier's lifeless faces was the lightning that illuminated his path, silencing any voice of hesitation. The confrontation in the alley was anything but heroic. It was dirty, desperate, and brutally intimate. Hector, caught by surprise, had no time to react. Rafael was not a trained killer. His first attempt was clumsy. They fought, falling to the filthy ground, the smell of garbage and fear filling the air. The gun went off, the muffled sound exploding in the confined space. The silence that followed was more deafening than the shot. Rafael stood there, panting, looking at what he had done. The act, which in his mind was a step toward justice, in reality proved to be a visceral plunge into darkness. The weight of the life he had taken crushed him, and the only thing he felt was not satisfaction, but a cold, profound emptiness. He returned to the church like a ghost, his hands trembling and his soul stained. In the sacristy, he turned on the tap over the baptismal font and tried to wash the blood from his hands. A stain he felt more on his conscience than on his skin. The water, which he had so often used to purify and bless, now seemed incapable of cleansing his transgression. He stripped off his cassock, the sacred vestment now feeling like a grotesque costume, and stood naked before God and himself, a murderer. That night, sleep did not come. He was haunted not by the face of his victim, but by the smiles of Miguel and Javier, questioning whether this act of violence honored them or merely dragged them into the same darkness that had consumed them. The news of Hector's death spread like wildfire. In the streets, where official information was rarely the truth, people spoke in whispers. No one mourned the end of the cartel henchmen, but everyone wondered who could have had the courage to do it. Since there were no signs of robbery or a gang fight, the popular imagination began to weave a legend. They spoke of a vengeful spirit, a shadow that came to settle the scores the law ignored. Soon, a name emerged, laden with fear and hope: the priest Vigilante. The moniker, born from urban folklore, became a powerful symbol, sowing panic among criminals and igniting a dangerous flame of admiration in the hearts of the oppressed. The second kill was easier, and that terrified Rafael. The target was the driver who had kidnapped the boys. This time, there was no hesitation, no physical struggle. Rafael cornered him at the exit of a clandestine bar, and the execution was quick, precise, almost surgical. He watched himself act with a frightening detachment, as if he were watching someone else. The righteous fury from the beginning was being replaced by a cold efficiency, a horrifying adaptation to his new calling. With every step he took on the path of vengeance, he felt a part of his former identity slipping away, replaced by a predatory instinct. He was becoming the weapon itself, an instrument of death growing sharper and dangerously more comfortable in its new, terrible function. As the legend of the Vigilante grew, the case landed on the desk of Detective Valenzuela. Young, honest, and still a believer in the system, he was an anomaly in a police force corroded by corruption. Initially, he saw the deaths as a simple internal cartel war, a house cleaning. However, his meticulous nature made him look closer. He was not like his colleagues, who were content to fill out reports and file cases away. Valenzuela visited the crime scenes, spoke with reluctant witnesses, and sensed that there was something different about these murders. There was a precision, an absence of greed that didn't fit the usual profile of the criminals he was used to pursuing. Valenzuela's investigation began to reveal a disturbing pattern. The victims, though low-ranking, were all key pieces in specific cartel operations, and all were linked in some way to the violence plaguing the Guadalupe Parish neighborhood. The way the bodies were left, almost as if on display, suggested a purpose, a message. The big break came when, at the scene of the third murder, he found something tiny fallen in the dust, something the forensics team had missed. A small, cheap wooden crucifix, like the ones distributed in churches. That insignificant object opened a door in his mind to a possibility so absurd that he almost dismissed it immediately. The cartel's reaction was, at first, one of disdain. El Hierro, the sadistic head of the UE local cell, was amused by the rumors of a killer priest. To him, it was just another fanciful story created by a desperate populace. He saw the vigilante as an insect to be crushed, an annoying distraction. However, when the third and fourth of his men fell, and his operations began to be affected, the amusement turned to fury. El Hierro, a man whose authority was based on absolute fear, could not tolerate such a challenge. He ordered his men to find the person responsible, promising a generous reward for the vigilante's head, grossly underestimating the nature and determination of the enemy he himself had created. In the midst of his bloody crusade, Rafael continued to see Maria. He saw her at Mass, a figure bent by grief, and with each visit, her sorrow was the gasoline that fueled the fire of his revenge. One day, she grabbed him by the arm, her eyes fixed on his, and confessed that she couldn't find forgiveness in her heart. "Father," she said, her voice choked, "I pray every day, but I don't ask God to forgive my son's murderers. I ask him to give them what they deserve. I ask for justice." Her words, spoken from the purest anguish of a mother, sounded to Rafael like an absolution. He wasn't betraying his faith. He was, perhaps, answering the prayers that God refused to hear. The weight of his actions, however, consumed him in his solitude. The nights were the worst. He would sit in the empty confessional, the silence of the church amplifying the turmoil in his soul. There, in the sacred place where he had heard the sins of so many, he confessed his own to the darkness. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned," he would whisper to the walls. "I have killed a man, and then another, and I will do it again." It was a ritual of psychological self-flagellation. There was no penance or forgiveness, only the echo of his own condemned voice, a dialogue with the abyss that had opened within him. The duality of his existence was tearing him apart. By day, the priest who comforted the grieving. By night, the monster who created new mourners. Valenzuela's investigation inevitably led him to the Guadalupe parish. He felt that the key to the mystery lay there, in that oppressed neighborhood that now seemed to breathe a different air. He tried to question the residents, but was met with a wall of silence. The same people who once trembled in fear of the cartel now looked at him with suspicion, protecting their avenging angel. Nobody knew anything. Nobody saw anything. Valenzuela realized that the priest Vigilante had become a folk hero, an unholy saint. The community's loyalty no longer lay with the law, which had abandoned them, but with the man who, through brutal means, was restoring a sense of order and safety. Rafael's audacity grew with his reputation. He realized that merely eliminating the soldiers wouldn't be enough to bring down El Hierro's empire. He had to attack the source of his power, the money. In a risky operation, he raided an abandoned warehouse that served as a drug lab and storage facility. The confrontation was intense and chaotic. More cartel men died, but the main objective was achieved. Rafael set fire to packages of cocaine and cash, watching the flames consume the poison that was destroying his community. That act marked an escalation in his war. He was no longer just an avenger. He was a crusader, determined to purify his city with fire, regardless of the cost to his own soul. The news of the torched warehouse hit El Hierro like a slap in the face. The financial loss was significant, but the blow to his reputation was devastating. A single man was dismantling his operation and making him look weak. El Hierro's fury boiled over. In a fit of sadistic rage, he tortured and executed one of his own lieutenants in front of the others, a brutal warning that failure would no longer be tolerated. The hunt for the priest Vigilante became his personal obsession. He mobilized all his resources, spreading informants throughout the city. The war, once fought in the shadows, was about to explode into open and merciless violence. The intensified hunt put Rafael in imminent danger. One night, following a lead, he walked straight into a trap. A shootout erupted in an abandoned industrial yard. By sheer instinct and luck, he managed to escape, but not unscathed. A bullet grazed his side, a searing pain that reminded him of his mortality. Hiding in an alley, pressing a piece of cloth against the wound, he felt fear for the first time since his journey began. He was not a supernatural entity, as the legend suggested. He was a man of flesh and blood, bleeding in the dark, alone, and hunted by both demons and the supposed angels of the law. The news that something was wrong with Rafael reached the ears of Father Antonio, his old friend and seminary mentor. Antonio traveled to the parish and found a man he barely recognized. The light in Rafael's eyes had been replaced by a cold, distant darkness. Antonio tried to reason with him, to appeal to the faith they once shared, to the man of compassion he knew still existed somewhere inside. "Vengeance belongs to the Lord, Rafael," he pleaded. "Don't become the monster you hunt." But his words found no echo. Rafael, his voice devoid of emotion, replied that the Lord had been absent and someone had to do the work in his place. "The community's pain became my strength," Rafael thought as he stitched his own wound by candlelight. Every face that looked at him with a spark of hope in the streets reminded him that he could not stop. He realized that eliminating the pawns was not enough. The snake would live as long as its head was intact. His mission now had a clear focus: to find and execute El Hierro. If you believe that one person can make a difference, even if the whole world is against them, continue with me on this journey. Your support, by subscribing and sharing, gives me the strength to keep telling stories of courage. As Rafael recovered, Valenzuela finally connected the pieces: the crucifix, the strategic location of the crimes, the community's protective silence, and finally, the escalation of the attacks to financial sabotage. Everything pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of the neighborhood and a deeply personal motivation. The image of Father Rafael López, with his fiery speech at the boy's funeral, returned to his mind. The idea was monstrous, a heresy against everything he believed in, but it made a terrible kind of sense. The detective reluctantly placed the priest at the top of his suspect list, feeling like a sinner himself for daring to think such a thing. Valenzuela decided to confront his suspicion head-on. He went to the Guadalupe church, using the pretext of seeking spiritual guidance. The meeting was a duel of wills, disguised as a pastoral conversation. Sitting on a bench in the silent church, they spoke of the nature of evil, of divine justice and human justice. Valenzuela probed, asking questions about anger and the desire for revenge. Rafael responded with biblical quotes and philosophical reflections, his words serving as both a shield and a sword. Both men left the meeting with their suspicions confirmed. Valenzuela knew he was facing the killer, and Rafael knew that the law, in the form of this honest detective, was closing in. Paranoia and isolation became Rafael's constant companions. He could no longer walk through his neighborhood as before, could no longer offer a blessing or a smile without feeling the weight of his double identity. He saw children playing in the street and felt a profound pain, for he fought for them in a way that forever distanced him from their innocence. He was a guardian who could no longer touch those he protected. The church walls, once his refuge, were now his prison. He was an island, a man haunted by his own actions, condemned to a loneliness that not even the completion of his revenge could cure. Frustrated and humiliated, El Hierro decided to force his enemy's hand. He knew the priest was driven by a twisted moral code, a sense of protection for the innocent. To lure the vigilante into a trap, he committed a calculated act of cruelty. He ordered his men to publicly kidnap and beat an old shopkeeper from the community, a man known for his generosity and his close friendship with the church. The message was clear and brutal. Come and get me, or more innocents will suffer the consequences of your actions. El Hierro had turned the entire city into his chessboard, using innocent lives as pawns. El Hierro's act, however, had the opposite effect of what he intended. Instead of isolating the vigilante through fear, the cruelty against the shopkeeper solidified the community's support. The people now had no doubt which side evil was on. The silent anger turned into a quiet rebellion. Small pieces of information, whispered in confessions, left in anonymous notes in the church's alms box, began to reach Rafael. Details about El Hierro's movements, about weaknesses in his fortress's security. The cartel had turned the oppressed into an army of spies for the man who had become their sole champion. Alone in his room, Rafael cleaned his wound and his gun with the same methodical concentration. He looked at his reflection in a broken piece of mirror and saw a stranger. His face was thinner, his eyes sunken, surrounded by dark circles. The expression was not one of anger, but of deep exhaustion, a grim resignation. The man who had been Father Rafael López, who believed in forgiveness and redemption, was dead. What remained was merely the instrument of his final will, a spectre consumed by his mission. He no longer asked himself if he was right or wrong. Such questions had become a luxury he could no longer afford. Valenzuela was at a crossroads. An anonymous call, with a voice distorted by guilt, gave him the final piece he was missing, a confirmation that Father Rafael was preparing for a final suicidal attack. The voice, which he suspected belonged to Father Antonio, begged him to stop Rafael before it was too late. Valenzuela now had enough to arrest him. But what would he do? Arrest the only man who was effectively cleansing the city of the evil the police themselves refused to fight? Let El Hierro win. The line between his duty and his conscience had never seemed so thin and so perilous. The plan was set. With the information received from the community, Rafael knew where and when to strike. It would be at El Hierro's mansion, on the outskirts of the city, during a meeting with his lieutenants. It was a fortress, and he knew the chances of getting out alive were minimal. Before leaving, he made one last visit to the cemetery. Standing before the small graves of Miguel and Javier, he did not pray. He just stood in silence for a long time, the cold night breeze blowing around him. It was a silent farewell and a promise. He couldn't bring the boys back, but he could ensure that the monster who took them would not hurt anyone else. Night fell over the city like a shroud. In his empty church, Rafael sat in the front pew, the pistol resting beside him. The air was heavy with the smell of candle wax and incense, scents of a life that was no longer his. He was not asking for forgiveness or seeking divine strength. He was simply waiting, at peace with the decision he had made. He had traveled a long way through the darkness, and the journey had led him here to this final moment. He was no longer a man in conflict. He was purpose incarnate. The priest, the man, and the monster had merged into a single entity, the Vigilante, and his time had come. El Hierro's mansion stood on a hill, a fortress of bad taste and arrogance that spewed light into the darkness of the night, indifferent to the misery it financed. Rafael approached through the shadows, moving with a fluidity his past before the seminary had taught him. The community's information was his map. Every blind spot in the surveillance, every flaw in the electrified fence, a path opened by whispers of revenge. He scaled the back wall, his aching body protesting, and landed in the perfectly manicured garden like a plague. Every step on the soft grass, every angel statue that watched him on the way was a profanation. He was not a guest. He was a spectre, the collector of a debt that would be paid in blood, crossing the threshold of hell to meet the devil on his own throne. After neutralizing 2 guards with silent, brutal efficiency, he reached a service window, as indicated in one of the anonymous notes. From inside he could hear the loud music and arrogant laughter of men who believed they were gods. He broke into the house, a cassocked phantom in the temple of excess. Reaching the grand hall, where El Hierro and his lieutenants were celebrating their dirty profits, Rafael shot the power panel, plunging the room into a darkness punctuated only by emergency lights. The chaos was instantaneous. In the panic, Rafael's shadowy figure emerged, his gun spitting fire. It was not an indiscriminate massacre. Every shot had a target, every bullet a sentence. He moved through the pandemonium, an angel of death in his own cathedral of violence. Amidst the shootout, El Hierro, showing the cowardice that hid behind his brutal facade, took advantage of the confusion to flee through a side door. He was not a soldier, he was a king who sent others to die. And for him, Rafael, even with a fresh graze on his arm, saw his target escape and pursued him, the adrenaline numbing the pain. The chase unfolded through the mansion's labyrinthine corridors, a deadly game of cat and mouse amidst expensive tapestries and stolen works of art. The opulent scenery, financed by the suffering of his community, only fueled Rafael's fury, making every step, every broken-down door, another nail in the cartel's coffin. He finally cornered El Hierro in his private office, a sanctuary of ego and blasphemy. Gold and ivory crucifixes shared wall space with photos of corrupt politicians and hunting trophies. There, under the light of an onyx lamp, the 2 men faced each other. El Hierro's fear had dissipated, replaced by a defiant arrogance. "So the famous priest Vigilante is real," he mocked. "Have you come to give me my last rites?" He approached, his sadistic smile widening. "I remember your boys. They cried a lot. They called for you and for God. Neither of you showed up to save them." Every word was a poison, calculated to destroy what was left of Rafael's soul. El Hierro's words hit their mark. The cold discipline Rafael had cultivated shattered, giving way to a wave of pure, primal rage. He dropped the gun and launched himself at the drug lord. The fight was savage, a clash of sheer force and hatred. Furniture was broken, art objects shattered. There was no technique, only the brutality of 2 men determined to destroy each other. Rafael, driven by A strength that came from the depths of his pain gained the upper hand. He subdued El Hierro, punching his face until the mocking smile became a mask of blood. He picked up the gun from the floor and pressed it against the forehead of the man who had taken everything from him. The final moment had arrived. Just as his finger began to squeeze the trigger, the sharp wail of sirens cut through the air, growing rapidly. Red and blue lights swept across the office window. The police, led by a determined Valenzuela, were storming the property. The office door was kicked in, and the detective entered, gun drawn. He froze, the scene before him freezing the moment in time. The priest Vigilante, the personification of vengeance, about to execute the city's biggest criminal. "Lopez, don't do it, it's over!" Valenzuela shouted, his voice echoing the struggle between the law and justice. El Hierro, spitting blood, began to laugh, believing that the system he had always manipulated would save him once more. Rafael looked up. He saw El Hierro's face, exultant in its evil. He saw Valenzuela's face, a good man trapped in a rotten system, and in his mind he saw the faces of Miguel and Javier, not as victims, but as they were in life, smiling. A cold clarity washed over him. Killing El Hierro would be revenge, but it would not be justice. With a cry that seemed to come from centuries of pain, he did not pull the trigger. Instead, he used the gun as a hammer, delivering a devastating blow to El Hierro's knee, who screamed in agony. He would let him live, but crippled, broken. He turned his back on the whimpering drug lord and faced Valenzuela. Before disappearing through a secret passage behind a bookshelf, he said, his voice empty, "Your work begins now." When the chaos in the mansion finally ceased, Detective Valenzuela was left with what remained of El Hierro's empire. The drug lord, now a broken man whimpering in pain, was arrested, along with all his surviving lieutenants. The operation was hailed as a great triumph of the law, a victory for the state against organized crime. Valenzuela, promoted, became the public face of this success. However, in every interview, with every medal he received, he felt the weight of a lie. He knew, just as everyone in the Guadalupe neighborhood knew, that the justice of that night had not come from a badge, but from the fury of a priest who dared to cross the line everyone else feared. The law reaped the rewards, but it was faith, in its darkest and most twisted form, that had planted the seed. Of Rafael López, nothing more was ever heard. He dissolved into the shadows from which he had emerged, a ghost who fulfilled his promise and vanished. The search for him was intense but fruitless. In his former community, no one had any information. The silence that had once protected him now sealed his legacy, turning him into an urban legend. To criminals, the priest Vigilante became a boogeyman, a story told to scare the newcomers. To the righteous, he was a reluctant saint, a fallen angel who sacrificed himself so that others could have peace. His church remained closed, a silent monument to a man who loved his flock so much that he became the wolf to drive away the other predators. The neighborhood, free from the cartel's iron fist, began to breathe again. Healing was a slow, painful process, marked by the scars of violence. But for the first time in years, children could play in the street until dusk without fear. Maria, Miguel's mother, found a kind of peace in the justice that was served, albeit through unholy means. She began to care for the abandoned church, sweeping its leaves and lighting candles on the empty altar. One candle for her son, one for Javier, and a third, always for the tormented priest who gave them vengeance at the cost of his own salvation. The community did not forget him. They simply understood that his sacrifice demanded their silence and respect. Far, far away, in a small, coastal town where no one knew his name, a man with slumped shoulders and a lost gaze watched the waves break on the shore. His face was Raphael's, but aged by pain and loneliness. He spent his days in silence, a spectre among the living. Sometimes he would sit in the back of a small local chapel, not to pray, but perhaps out of habit or to feel the echo of a life he could never reclaim. He watched the families, heard the laughter of children, and in his eyes there was an abyss of longing. He had become a guardian from a distance, condemned to protect the innocence he himself had lost forever, a shepherd without a flock and without God. Rafael's story forces us to question the boundaries between right and wrong. Did he find justice for the boys, or did he simply lose himself in his own thirst for vengeance? By becoming a monster to fight other monsters, he saved his community but condemned himself to an eternal exile from his own humanity. The end of his journey offers no easy answers, only the echo of a conflicted soul. If stories like this, which explore the depths of the human condition, resonate with you, your subscription to the channel is essential for us to continue. We are immensely grateful that you have stayed with us until the end of this intense and somber journey.